Hey, what's up everyone? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be working on a 2011 BMW M3 on the lift behind me. So, just in case you couldn't tell what we're going to be doing, we're going to be replacing engine mounts and transmission mounts. This car has almost 49,000 miles on it with the original mounts, and particularly the right side engine mount is starting to look a little bit pancaked. Interesting phenomenon on these cars, these engine mounts are the exact same mounts that we use in E93 M3 and an E46 M3, and those got carried over to this generation E90, E92, E93 M3 as well, and they all suffer the same problem where the right side engine mount, which is typically compressed with engine movement, just starts to become shorter and shorter and shorter over time. The thing that I've noticed the most with this car, this is my personal vehicle, is sometimes third gear in certain situations is very difficult to find, and that's because the drivetrain is suffering from excessive movement. So, to resolve that problem, we need to replace the engine mounts. This is about the time you should do it anyway on these cars, but we're going to be using the 034 Motorsport 55 durometer solid rubber engine mounts and transmission mounts, which are like an OEM plus upgrade, as opposed to solid mounts, Delrin, polyurethane. These should retain a good level of ride quality and reducing the NVH or keeping it to a minimum, while providing a little bit of firmness within the drivetrain to make it feel a little bit crisper, particularly with the shifts. We are going to have to lower the subframe to do this, so we have all the replacement hardware for the subframe, the steering shaft bolt, and all of the other one-time use hardware that's on this car. So now we talked about the parts that we're going to be installing, what we're going to be doing. Let's talk about some of the tools we need to do this job, and then we can go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so some of the tools we need for this job: 18mm sockets, 16mm sockets, 13mm socket, 10mm socket, an 8mm socket, and an E14 torque socket. The E14 is going to be needed for 4 of the new subframe bolts. They go from 18mm to E14. Along with this, I have an E10 Torx on a swivel extension. That is for the steering shaft coupler. You don't necessarily need a tool like this. An E10 on an extension will work just fine, but I happen to have one that has a built-in extension, which is super useful on many BMW applications. You'll want a pry bar. This will be really useful for getting the engine lined back up with the new engine mounts. You'll also want a 13mm wrench for the trans mounts. The upper nuts are just impossible to get to with any other tool. Variety of ratchets, torque wrench that could do at least 110 newton meters of torque. Obviously, the assortment of power tools is always useful, and because you're going to have the hood open and potentially using some sort of engine support bar, I really recommend using one of these hood clamps. That's for the hood lift supports. Will prevent the hood from crashing down if one of the gas lift supports were to fail. Along with that, depending on how you want to support the engine, we'll be using engine support bar. You could potentially use just blocks of wood or a jack stand. It's going to totally depend on how you're going about taking care of this operation, but these are the primary tools we're going to use for this job. With that said, let's go and jump right into it. The first thing we're going to have to do is support the engine from the top, because in order to do engine mounts on this car, the front subframe has to be lowered. There just isn't any other way to get it out, and there's not enough vertical room to push the engine up to clear coming out. So we're using engine support brace here on the front of the engine. We're going to hook it to the lift point here on the front of the engine. That'll secure it in place. Also need to take off the wheels, since we will be lowering the front subframe. Don't want that extra weight on the end of the suspension. And then from there, we'll start removing some of the undershields underneath the car to gain access to what we need to do in order to lower the subframe. All right, so like any typical BMW, we have a bunch of splash shields underneath the car. They're held down by 8 and 10mm fasteners. We need to remove these in order to eventually lower the subframe. Now, in the case of this specific car, it does have a splitter on the front of it. Pretty much strictly cosmetic, not very functional, but it does need to come off in order to get the forward screws. So this is going to be different depending your car has one of these or not and how it was attached, but this is actually removable with hardware. In your case, hopefully it's not affixed with screws, because that would just make it a little bit more difficult. Yeah. It also goes without saying, while you're pulling this down, be aware that debris might come down, so keep your eyes clear. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and remove the reinforcement plate, which is held on by these 16mm bolts here. Don't forget about these 8mm in the back. That would have been bad. Now we got the last bolt kind of holding this thing on, so make sure you're holding on to it. You got a good firm grip. Now we're gonna go ahead and remove the steering shaft bolt to the steering rack. It's an E10 Torx. You can move the wheel a little bit to gain access to it, but there is a window through the subframe on the side to get at it. These are Loctited from the factory, so the way that it came out is kind of normal. And we will replace this. Next up, we have this connector right here. This is for the Servotronic steering solenoid. We're just gonna unplug that because the subframe is gonna be lowered, so we don't wanna pull on that connector. Simultaneously, we have our headlight level sensor here. We're gonna unplug that as well. We're gonna leave the level sensor attached to the subframe, but there's only so much room for that to come down, and we don't wanna damage that either, so unplug it as well. The connector's got 2 locks on it, and you have to pinch both sides to release it, but that one at the top is kind of difficult, so I just use an angled pick to, unlock it from the top, use my thumb on the bottom, and then just use the flathead screwdriver to get it going. There's a weather pack seal in here, so they can sometimes be a little bit difficult to get moving. So we got a bunch of 8mm fasteners here that hold on to this plastic shield here in the rear. We need this out of the way so that we can gain access to the rearward subframe bolts. So I'll go ahead and remove these now. And then we got 2 T30 screws, plastic, also holding the side skirts. You should come out no problem, but if you feel any kind of binding, be careful. A lot of debris will also get collected behind these as well, so be aware of that. Just in case you happen to be on your back looking up, we're at the point now where we could start to loosen our subframe bolts and also take out the lower engine mount nuts over here. I'm leaving the suspension bolted. You don't have to undo any of the control arms because we're not completely removing the subframe. We're just lowering it down. Another thing as well, if you have the normal or regular thrust arms with the rubber bushing, you are gonna have to loosen this bolt here, just because that's gonna create a bind and it's not gonna allow the subframe to lower. I have a Synchro Design Works thrust arm, so it's just a ball joint in there. And then the factory wishbone is also a ball joint. So there's tons of articulation in the suspension already, and this thing could droop down. But if you do have the rubber bushings on the thrust arm, I do recommend you loosen that bolt here, which you will also have to replace because it's torque to yield. But that's just so you don't stress the bushing in the stock control arm. So first we'll take 16mm socket and remove our engine mount nuts that secure the engine mount to the subframe. These are being replaced with the new engine mounts, so those go in the junk pile. So on our factory subframe bolts, we have 16mm, 18mm, 18mm, and then another 18mm. However, 2 of these forward subframe bolts are going to be replaced by E14 bolts. So these original ones are going to be different when we go to reinstall. But for now, 16 and 3 18s mirrored on both sides. So 2 16s and 6 18s. So for these forward bolts, I'm just going to loosen them and allow the subframe to drop down on its own. Which you can already see it's starting to move. Went ahead and just slid the steering shaft off, popped off no problem. And that is also keyed so it can only go back on one way. We'll make sure everything is aligned and straight when we go to put it back together. I just don't want the steering shaft being pulled with the subframe. As you can see right now, this thing is just kind of hanging here. We do still have 2 subframe bolts in the back here, so it's pretty much just hanging by the longer of the 4 subframe bolts, which is fine. What I'm being aware of or conscious of here is our power steering hoses, the ones that are bolted here to the subframe. I'm going to probably unbolt these brackets so that it's not pulling by the hoses, if that makes sense. And then I'm also going to get a little pull jack to support the subframe so I can finally let it come down all of the way. So we have 10mm screws that secure these here to these brackets on the subframe. These are just little insulated clamps. I mean, the key here is I just don't want the weight of the subframe pulling down on these hoses and potentially damaging them, because then you have to replace them, and that would suck. Because if you ever looked at a power steering hose diagram for this car, it's a little silly. Got one 10mm over here, which has another one of these insulated P-clamps. So we're going to loosen this up, and that's going to allow us to free up this pressure pipe. And I believe after that, nothing else is technically affixed to the subframe. So we got one 10mm right here at this forward portion of the subframe. And then you have a 10mm nut back here at the sway bar bushing. This kind of secures a bracket, which has two hoses on it. And just kind of confirming everything is loose, which does appear to be that way. Unless the bracket, nope, it doesn't go in there, so that's good. So yeah, we should be good at this point. My tip of the day is going to be to thread all of these screws back into the brackets you removed them from. That way when you go to put it back together later, there's not really a mystery as to which one came from where. Also worth mentioning that these power steering lines do suffer from corrosion. And this car is garage kept. It's been in a garage most of its life. And I mean, you can see the corrosion on it. So if you have a car that's literally parked outside or is driven in inclement weather, it's not uncommon to see the hard portion of these lines to be completely rotted away. So we still have two subframe bolts holding the weight of the subframe up. I don't want to just pull those out and then let the subframe drop. I want to slowly lower the subframe, treat it with some respect. So I'm going to use a pull jack right here towards the middle. This is the largest cross member here to support the weight of the subframe. And then once I have those two bolts out, I can then go ahead and lower it down with the pull jack. It is aluminum subframe, so it is very light. That's the one positive here. But if you were doing this, like let's say on jack stands, you can use a blocks of wood or just a jack. But either way, just don't let this thing come crashing down. Want to do it slowly. Plus, with the engine supported from the top, you want to make sure that the engine's not going to shift around or anything like that while you're doing this. You just want to make sure that you're being smart and you're being safe while you're doing this kind of work. All right, so everything is good on this front. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to move our pull jack here to the front. So now that the subframe has been lowered, you can see the top of the engine mount. So that is the nut right there, and that is the engine mount. There's no other access to this, and like I said, the subframe has to be lowered because there just isn't any other way to gain access. This is our right side engine mount, and it looks basically the same over there on the left side. So this is really the preferred method, and it's really not that much to get to this point. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the 16mm nut now, and slide this right side engine mount out, and I'm gonna do the same on the left side. So, like I said, these are the original engine mounts from this car. These were installed back in September of 2010 in Germany when the car was built. So we're gonna do a little comparison on this right side engine mount compared to a new left side engine mount, or just, well, they're saying left and right, but we're gonna do a comparison between new and old. The right side engine mounts always get smushed, and that causes a little bit of a misalignment with the entire drivetrain. This is not the worst, but you can actually start to see it's kind of cracking from around here and it's cracking in there. So I'll be very interested to see how much this has collapsed. See some cracking on this one too. Interestingly enough, the cracking on this side is where the engine is pulled, right? Because I want you to consider when the drivetrain is loaded, it's always moving towards the right. And so you can see that this has been getting pulled from this side and it's starting to crack as the rubber has sort of dried out. So let's do some measurements. Kind of curious to see how these compare to new mounts. Compare left to right. See the right side mount is definitely shorter, particularly that top crowned portion. These are also liquid filled from the factory, whereas the 034 Motorsport mounts we're installing are going to be solid rubber. So yeah, I'm curious to see how these stack up. So we got a brand new 034 Motorsport mount. This is the one that's going to be going in the car. So I'm going to measure the height of a brand new mount. Now mind you, this car has 48,000 miles, almost 49,000. So by most standards, these would be considered new. But just to show you how these mounts do not hold up on these cars, I think this is worth highlighting. So brand new mount, we're gonna call it 69.5 millimeters. So anywhere from 69 to 69.5. Here's our left side engine mount. 65.04 millimeters, so almost 4.5 millimeters smaller. And now we're going to go to the right side mount. 64 millimeters. So the right side engine mount is off by about 5, and the left side mount is off by 4. But that's quite a bit of compression for a car with 48,000 miles, almost 49,000 miles. At this point, we're going to go ahead and put our new engine mounts in. Also, hot tip, now is a really good time to replace the engine ground strap. These things look pretty nasty with age. They'll turn green. This was replaced a couple of years ago, so it doesn't look like junk, but it's going to be the easiest time now to replace this while you're here. So have that on hand, just in case. So just slide the new engine mount in. The trick with all of this is just know there is absolutely no chance that you're going to be able to torque the upper nut. You're just gonna have to get it as tight as possible. There's also these dowels, like this little dowel pin on the bottom of the engine mount that needs to line up with the corresponding notch on the subframe. So when you drop it in place, it's going to be towards the outside, but just wiggle the engine mount back and forth until it drops in place. You'll feel it like drop in. Otherwise, it's going to be off to the side and that dowel will start to eat into the subframe over a period of time, and that would not be a good thing. So just make sure you have that lined up appropriately. We'll thread a nut in for now, just to kind of keep it in place. We do have access to the top of the stud from behind, and we'll be able to actually tighten it down once the subframe is back up in place. But there's just not a lot of room there, and you just can't torque that top nut, so you're just gonna have to make it tight. Tight is the torque spec in that case. I will do this because I don't want this engine mount to move or spin when we're putting it back up in place. I am just gonna tighten down the nut from underneath so that it locks the engine mount into position. And we'll come back and we'll at least torque this bottom side afterwards. So again, that dowel on the bottom of the mount is going to face towards the outside of the car. Move it around until you feel like it drops into position. And then we'll go ahead and tighten the engine mount nut down from the bottom so that it's at least locked in place. And again, we will torque that bottom side nut once it's locked up. Now I'm just going to go ahead and raise our subframe back up into position. A couple things to note. Number one, make sure that the engine mounts, like the studs, go through the engine support brackets. And then you're also going to guide the steering shaft back onto the steering rack. The orientation of that steering joint has not changed since we took it off. And the steering is a little bit towards the right now. That's just kind of the angle that we had to set it at to get to the bolt that secures the joint to the steering shaft. So Just need to, number one, get everything lined back up and make sure all of these subframe holes line back up, and we should be good. So another thing I just did, I just put this rearward subframe bolt back in on both sides, just like not even bottomed out. I left like ½ an inch of threads. The point is, right now with everything attached, the subframe wants to just move backwards, so that bolt being in is going to prevent the subframe from shifting too far backwards. I got to eventually line up all the subframe holes, I got to line up the engine mount holes, and I got to get the steering shaft on. So having that in the back to sort of support and prevent the movement back is just going to help me do that a little bit. There we go. Come on, start. So now we have the engine mounts aligned, and one thing to explain, where I was doing the pry bar, the engine can still rock a little bit at the bottom, and the studs have to line up through the engine support brackets, and the engine mounts themselves are flexible, so the point was I just needed to get the stud to sit through the hole, and I just had a little, basically move it back and forth to get them lined up, and then once the stud was going through, put the nut on top to secure it. At this point, I'm going to raise the subframe further up in order to get the steering shaft back onto the steering rack. We have not changed the orientation of how any of this lined up originally, so steering should still be straight ahead. It can only go back on one way, so that kind of removes any ambiguity that there would be here. But I have to kind of wiggle this thing on while raising up the subframe so that it will engage with the steering rack. There we go. So I was able to reach up from the front and behind and slide the steering joint back down onto the spline shaft for the steering rack. That just kind of took a little bit of maneuvering. It should slide down easily. If it doesn't slide down easily, it's most likely because it's not lined up. And while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and put the bolt back in. It should thread in no problem, but there is a Loctite on it, so you do have to get past the Loctite. But you shouldn't have to force the screw through or anything like that. It should thread in on its own. We will torque that in a moment, but I just want to get that back in so that the steering shaft can't slide off. Steering wheel is turned a little bit this way, so I'm going to go ahead and just eyeball it straight. There is an alignment mark on top of the steering rack and on this little plastic boot. I'm just going to actually get a ladder, hop up in the car, make sure that the steering wheel is pointed straight ahead, and we'll know that the alignment is correct on that, but it should be fine. So went ahead, looked, the steering wheel is pointed straight ahead, and then if you look at the top of the steering rack there, that plastic cover that has a little triangle right where that little green mark is, that is directly over the top of an alignment mark that's in the casting of the steering rack. So those line up, the steering wheel is in the correct straight ahead position, the wheels are pointed straight ahead, so therefore it is the correct alignment. That's how you would double check to make sure it's good to go on this, but all those things have to line up, and again, as long as you put everything back together the way that was when it came apart, you're not going to have a problem. But worth it to take a look, double check, and make sure that it's all good now, so you're not disappointed later on and you have to do this all over again. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and tighten down these top nuts. This will probably be the last time we have access to them, so while they're still easy to get to, we're just going to make them tight because unfortunately we cannot put a torque wrench on these, and that's okay. I'm happy with that. Come over here and do the same on this side. Good. So at this point, we now need to start putting bolts back in for our subframe. Important thing to note, there are 4 different lengths of subframe bolts, and like I said earlier, 2 out of 4 of the bolts are being replaced by this newer style, which are E14 drive from the original 18mm. The alignment of our subframe is really based off these dowels here on the frame rails in the front. So we need to get our subframe lined back up with the holes in the chassis. In the forward portion here, there's a dowel on the body of the car that orients our subframe back with the chassis. This is pretty much the square head position, so both the left and right side of the subframe need to line up with this, and then it'll eventually go into place. We don't want to just push the subframe up and hope those line up. We want them to guide in smoothly. So I need to look at both sides while I'm doing this. But once those are lined up, I'll be able to put in the new forward bolts. These are E14s from the original E18s. These are the second longest bolt that go in. The longest bolts in the kit are actually here for the rearward position. And then we have the 16mm in the back here, that stays the same. And then this one here is still gonna be an 18mm. But we'll talk about the bolt sizes and where those go just for reference. But at this point, just lining up the subframe with the chassis. Love to see it. Okay, that's lining up, it's going up. All right, so what I'm looking for, I just want to see that as I'm tightening or threading in those forward bolts, that the subframe is starting to slide up on those dowels, because that's where the alignment comes from. They're going up no problem. Like, I'm choked up on this ratchet, I'm not having to force it, so we're good to go on that front. We'll go ahead and grab the rest of the subframe bolts, and we'll talk about the lengths and which ones go where, and we'll go about after that torquing our subframe. All right, so here's our second E14 bolt. It is the long one. It's gonna go in sort of the middle here, right behind the wishbone. So we'll thread those up next. So the 2 forward subframe bolts, these are the newer design that are now E-Torx instead of the original 18mm drive. We have these bigger 18mm bolts here that are gonna go into this rearward position. These are still the same from the original design. And these go in at an angle. Just wanna get those started. But what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna draw down the front of our subframe flush with the frame rails. And once those are flush, we'll be able to tighten down these bolts in the rear because those should then line up. It's just because at an angle, they won't go in all the way and there's not enough of a slot for the bolt to go through in the subframe. So at this point, I'm more than confident we're lined up correctly. So I'm gonna go ahead and just draw these bolts down until they're basically just tight with the ratchet. They will need to be torqued. But there is a procedure for that, which we will follow. My advice for this is you want to go side to side, so you don't want to draw the bolts down on one side. You want to draw the bolts down in the same position on both sides. So I'm going to start on the forward subframe bolts because that's how your chassis alignment is established. Now I'll go ahead and tighten down our 18mm bolts. These should now thread in easily, no problem at all. And at no point in time should you feel like you need to force this into position. It should all just thread in, no problem, all 4 corners. And if it doesn't, you either have potentially damaged threads or there's something out of alignment, but you don't want to force these, nor is there a need to. So all of the M12 bolts, which is going to be locations 1, 2, and 3, so the E14s and the 18mm, we're going to torque those to 108 Newton meters. We need to start from the forward position. So start front left, then the front right, and then we'll do the M12s just behind the wishbones, side to side, and then we'll do the 18mm. And then the 16mm has a different torque spec. We'll talk about that when we get there. 103 Newton meters. So no torque angle here. are 16mm bolts in the rear, which are M10 thread. These are actually the same bolts that hold the reinforcement plate to the subframe. These are 56 Newton meters plus 90 degrees, and that's also what the reinforcement plate is torqued to. So same bolt, same spec. So my recommendation is to do the set torque first, which is 56 Newton meters side to side, then do the 90, then do the 90. That way you're evenly drawing it down. Torque spec for the steering shaft coupler bolt, 24 Newton meters.
You literally just checked it, didn't you, when you sent the photos?
The subframe, or engine mount to subframe nuts, 16mm, same as the top, 56 Newton meters, 16mm drive. I love hearing the engine mount crunch whatever sand is left between it and the subframe. All right, we're gonna go ahead and plug our Servotronic steering connector back in, listen for the click, and also our headlight level sensor. That clicked. Always want to make sure it clicks. Really all that we have left at this point is need to resecure all the power steering lines back to the subframe, all 10mm stuff, and once those are resecured and repositioned, we can then go ahead and move to the trans mounts, which does not involve lowering a subframe, but we do need to lower the cross member for it, but that's a little bit easier, just a little bit. Get up over there and get up in there. All right, so now that everything is resecured for the engine mounts and the subframe and everything like that up front, we're gonna go ahead and move to our trans mounts, which are back here. And it is a good idea to do trans mounts as the same time you're doing engine mounts. Those do wear together. Trans mounts, not nearly as much, but it doesn't make sense to leave the original, in this case, 12-year-old engine mounts in place when you have brand new engine mounts up front. So I'm gonna do it at the same time. So next up, do the transmission mounts. We have the transmission cross member back here, and we need to remove this aero shield from underneath the car. Biggest thing here is when we unbolt the bracket from the chassis, we don't want this thing drooping back and putting a lot of pressure on our engine mounts. So we're going to use a pole jack to support it. But we're just going to go ahead and remove the shield first. So a bunch of 10mm and 8mm screws and nuts. We'll go ahead and remove the 13mm fasteners here. These are for our trans mount to the cross member. And from here, we'll unbolt our cross member to the chassis. So this is all 13mm. And again, I have the weight of the transmission supported by a pole jack. If you were doing this on jack stands, you can use your jack for that. I was hoping I'd be able to pull the cross member down without having to loosen up those top nuts, just to have the cross member out of the way so I can get better access to it. But unfortunately, the angle of those studs makes it impossible to pull the cross member down and off these trans mount studs. So I need to remove these nuts entirely. The only positive is I don't believe these are self-locking screws, or nuts rather, so by the time they start to get loose, should be able to unthread them with my fingers. Yeah, you can't exactly see this on camera, but I'll point to where these are located once the cross member is out of the way. It's actually kind of interesting how these transmission mounts locate into the bracket, because you can't just pull them out. You have to actually rotate it a little bit and then you can pull it out. So it kind of like encapsulates itself. And you know, these look perfectly fine. I would expect them to be. With the 034 mounts, the one thing I have noticed, so I could flex these quite a bit. They have some play in them. If I take a brand new 034 mount significantly more rigid. However, it's still rubber, so it does still have some play. It's not a totally solid piece, but will definitely help reduce some of that side-to-side slop that you technically get in the drivetrain with factory-style mounts. This is still a factory-style mount, but it just has a little bit more reinforcement in it, so it's not going to move around as much. We'll still absorb vibrations and all those things, but we'll also tighten up the drivetrain a decent amount, which is always a benefit, particularly when you are looking for any kind of performance improvements. The new mounts are going to install just like the old ones came out, so they kind of just do that lock into place routine. I've chosen to use the exact same nuts on the bottom as the top. I actually prefer these for transmission mounts. The ones that came off are these style, and they don't really have a very big flange on them. The top nuts are this style, and they have this flange that's encapsulated with the head of the nut. Not only is that flange a lot larger and has more surface area, but these, generally speaking, I like the way that they install. I like the way they tighten down. They're just nicer. So we'll go ahead and place the trans mount back up into location. I'm going to take the new hardware for the top, which is the same as the bottom. We'll get the threads started first. All I'm doing here is just putting the cross member bolts back in so that I know it's lined up before I start tightening down those upper trans mount nuts, which I'm going to do first. Because as I tighten down these nuts, it's going to kind of draw the cross member up, and I don't want the cross member to get out of alignment when that happens. Also, the nice thing about these specific nuts, when I was talking about the encapsulated washers, which they use up top, the nut itself does not lock. The washer is what locks the fastener into place. So in a situation like this where there's absolutely no room, if it was a normal self-locking nut, you'd have to sit there with a wrench and turn it a quarter turn at a time. At least this, you can bottom it out with your hands and then tighten it down with a wrench. So that was some nice thinking. And again, I do like the larger flange. We're not going to be able to torque that these top nuts. So really what we're going to do is we're going to use our minds here, and we're going to remember that these do not have to be excessively tight. It's only a 13mm nut, M8 size thread, so we're just trying to keep it from coming loose down the road, not tightening it so much that it'll never come loose again or pull the threads off the stud. We don't need to go crazy here. We just need these to be tight. Go ahead and start bottoming out our nuts down here, and the screws for the cross member into the frame rail of the car. I'm going to assume all of these torque specs are somewhere between 23, 24, 25 Newton meters. I'm going to confirm real quick, but I don't think these have a special spec on them or anything like that. Torque spec on all of these nuts and screws is 19 Newton meters and 13mm drive. The only one we're not torquing is going to be those nuts at the top. If we had a crow's foot that was long, we might be able to get to it, but I'm reasonably satisfied that we're good to go on that front. So cool. Trans mounts are in. So now that our trans mounts are in place, we can go ahead and reinstall many of the undercar shields that we removed. We're going to start with our transmission aero shield first. since that's the last piece that we installed, so we'll work from the back to the front. We're gonna put the reinforcement plate back in. So this is, we're gonna be using new hardware for this. All new 16mm bolts. The narrow end is towards the front. And I just want to get a couple bolts started here. And the weight of this thing is supported before I step out from under it. So with the new reinforcement plate hardware installed, we're going to torque all of them to 56 Newton meters and then 90 degrees. These are the same bolts as our rearward subframe bolts, so same spec. I'm going to put our rearward, part of our rearward splash shield in the back here. This covers the subframe. This has just a, let's see, it looks like 5 8mm self-tapping screws, and it has those 2 plastic T30s that have to line back up with our side skirt. 8mm self-tapping screws. Just want to make sure that these plastic screws line back up where they need to be. So the cable that was all chewed up, went ahead and replaced it because we had it in stock. So it didn't really make sense to put it back on in the broken state that it was in. So what I'm trying to do with the cable is basically latch it first. So the cable that supports this piece latches onto this bracket right here. To get it in, simply push up in position, rotate it 90 degrees, and then slide it back, and there you go. Supports it. My other recommendation would be when you actually remove it, just take this forward piece off, and then you'll be able to get this out of the way immediately. You can unbolt it from down here, but if you do that, you risk spinning the cables and tearing them up, kind of like what happened here. So I would avoid doing that if you can. And then this is, of course, secured by the same 8mm self-tappers we've all come to know and love. So that's how you go about replacing engine mounts and transmission mounts on E90, E92, and E93 M3s, so 2008 to 2013. It's going to be the same, whether it's a DCT or a manual car. There is no difference in the parts. Overall, fairly straightforward. I know that dropping or lowering the subframe might seem like a difficult task, but it really isn't, especially since you could leave the suspension connected. Just make sure that you line everything back up when you put it back up in a position, and you'll be perfectly fine. But overall, you know, 48,000 mile car, the engine mounts were on their way to being collapsed, if not collapsed. 5mm difference is pretty significant. So I expect that this car will not only drive much better, but definitely shifting to third. I expect third gear to be there all the time now, as opposed to only there sometimes, which is pretty much how it felt. With that said, hope you learned something in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit that like button. Also, subscribe. We have a lot of videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.